Hi, everybody.
Hello.
My name is Lorna Fitzpatrick. It's a pleasure to have you all here with us at this month's NCBI Advocacy Talks session for November. It's our final session for this year, and we're delighted to have the support of South Dublin County Council's Social Inclusion Unit for this month's session. Today, our session is called More Than a Seat at the Table, Experiences of People Who are Blind and Vision Impaired in Decision Making. And at this webinar, you're going to hear from 3 NCBI advocates and service users about their experiences of having their voices heard in the public policy conversations that affect their right to independent lives. So today we're joined by Maura Meany from County Clare, with David Cortacahoon from Dublin, and with Audrey Tormley also from Dublin. And so I'm going to ask each of our panelists some questions, but you can also ask some questions too. So if you wish to put any questions forward to any of the panelists, you can do so through the chat function or the question function on your screen. And my colleague Liz is monitoring that question box so we can come to them at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to jump straight into the questions because this is all about hearing from our advocates and our panelists today. So the first question, and Audrey, I might start with you if that's okay on this one, and then move to David and then to Maura. And the first question is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to being a member of a representative committee?
Yeah, well, thank you for the invitation. I've always been interested and kind of been a strong advocate for kind of standing up for and representing oneself, and at college and prior to that as well. And then I obviously started to work with NCBI. My background is teaching, so I started working in NCBI around 2006 and working with students in the training centre. And we've had an advocacy group there over the last couple of years, and I always found it fascinating to listen to people's feedback and encourage them to and their individual journeys as well, and to encourage them to speak up and represent their needs as people with sight loss. So then I was asked to become involved with the PPN Dún Laoghaire, and I was at one meeting in recent weeks, and fascinating to get insights into other people with other disabilities and their journey, but equally to represent people with sight loss and advocate on our behalf. I mean, I know people with sight loss, we might have similar sight loss, but we all have different journeys and different backgrounds, and it's good kind of to listen and to learn from one another. So yeah, I'd be a huge advocate on behalf and kind of person interested in representing the views of people with sight loss, definitely.
Thanks so much, Audrey. That's fantastic. And David, I might pose the same question to yourself. So can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to becoming a member of a representative committee?
Yeah, that is true. I actually started high school and college. There were so many oppressions and disadvantage among poor people in the community that we live in, and the school we attended was the same problem. Even down to the university, there was so much corruption. So, being a student union leader at the time, we always come up with some sort of a resolution to be able to get a public awareness and student awareness of what is going on in the college, especially for most of the students that were there, and they have so many disadvantages. So that was how my activity started. Then at the peak of the Civil War, I became a refugee. Problems in the refugee camp in terms of non-governmental agencies coming in to provide services for refugees that were inadequate. And we have across the section number of old and mothers who are deprived of things that they really need. And I was again able to organize a group there to become a voice for the people in the refugee camp. And on top of that, I left because there was another war. Then eventually I went to another country, the same problem. Then in the end, I ended up coming to Ireland as a student. But with that background, I had been really involved in that. Then unexpectedly, when they diagnosed me with advanced glaucoma, I became confused. I couldn't understand what was happening with the hospital, but they referred me to NCBI to get further care. And to be honest, over these years, NCBI has been tremendous in making sure that I get adjusted to my situation. They give me mobility training at the same time. I went to the rehabilitation school. And with all due respect, Audrey is my professor. She was very, very good to me at the time I was there. She introduced me to advocacy again in that school and an NCBI. So living with, I know what it means about oppression and poverty. And being a disabled person again, I've seen how bad it is to be marginalized. And I strongly believe in our experiences. And the best people to be able to address our problem are those that are victims of the situation. So I believe to speak out and to say the fact to the public and the authorities is the right thing for people that are infected. So that really moved me again. I think this agency, that they are very, very good in making sure that the services are there for people that are blind. I got to make sure I join them and speak out and help them to push the service objective forward. That's how I get involved with NCBI.
That's great, David.
Over the years,
thank you.
Yeah.
That's fantastic, and it's really great to have such an insight throughout the years and how you've been involved in so many different areas. And you're a tremendous advocate with NCBI, absolutely, no doubt. And Maura, I might pose the same question to you, just in terms of telling us a little bit about yourself and your journey to becoming a member of a representative committee or getting involved in representation.
Well, Lorna, I suppose I describe myself first of all as a person with dual sensory disabilities since birth, and I suppose that in a sense coloured my upbringing and my education, in that, you know, I went to St Mary's School for the Blind back in the 70s and 80s, and after school I started working as a telephonist. But it was in my 30s, I suppose. Well, I suppose two things. I moved to Cork in 1992. And I suppose it was when I moved to Cork first that I had my first dip into advocacy, if that's the way you'd put it, by joining what was then People with Disabilities in Ireland, and also the Cork Disability Partnership Forum. And I enjoyed the work. I suppose as far back as when I was in school, I was always kind of, I'd stand up for other people, or I'd, you know, if I thought something wasn't right or it was unfair, or if it could be done better or differently, I would quietly make my views known. And I suppose my interest in kind of advocating for people came from that sense of wanting justice for people. So when I was in Cork, then I went back to education. I went back and I studied sociology and history. And ironically enough, it was while I was doing sociology and my master's in sociology that I really became interested in disability issues. You know, learning all about the social models and the medical models and other models of disability, but what they actually meant for people with disabilities and how things were on the ground for people with disabilities. And I suppose life got in the way, the advocacy work went by the side. But 3 years ago, I moved to Shannon, back home to my own hometown. And I became involved with the local Limerick advocacy network of NCBI. And it was through that I started with the Limerick PPN, which I suppose I'm still learning, and I'm in my infancy with it, and it's in its infancy with me, if that's the way you'd put it. But I'm learning and I'm enjoying it, and I feel it's a real way for people to have their voice heard. It's a real way to be involved in some of the policy decisions that are being made at a local Limerick level, and not just for people who are blind and vision impaired, but also for people with all disabilities, but as well as that, for people in the wider community, because often what impacts on people with disabilities and blind and vision impaired people will also impact on ordinary members of the community.
Yeah. That's very true, Maura. And you're actually leading me in really nicely into our next question, so I might actually stick with you for to start off the next round, if that's okay. But it's to learn a little bit about your experience of being on that PPN, or being in the structures where these decisions are being made, and having a seat at that table. What have you learned about it, and what have you learned about being involved in those discussions where those decisions are being made that affect so many different people and can affect them in so many different ways?
Well, I suppose I've learned a few things, and I'm continuing to learn, but I think one of the big things I've learned for myself is that it is actually very much a privilege to be at that table and to have my voice heard in policy decision making. And when I say it's a privilege, I'm not representing, as I said, just myself, but I'm representing many members of the community. And as such, it's when I speak at the table, so to speak, I'm not just representing myself, and I have to remember that all the time. And that was a big learning for me, because I'm often inclined to think in terms of my own experience, and without actually meaning for it to assume that everybody has the same experience, sometimes it can come across that way. So I constantly have to remember this, that I am representing all members of the community, the local community. I think one of the other things I've learned is about taking personal responsibility for how I perform when I'm at linkage group meetings or specific policy committee meetings. And what I mean by that is, I suppose as a vision impaired person and hearing impaired person, I do things a little differently to the way my fellow reps on the committee would do things. And I also maybe need a little bit of extra help to do things. So in terms of that, like figuring out for myself what works best for me. So for me, bringing my iPad to a meeting is essential, and actually being able to use the iPad at the meeting. And then down on top of that, asking for help if I need it. So for instance, we recently had our first in-person meeting in the last 18 months. And this was for the SPC. And I sat at that meeting and I was not able to join in the meeting because I couldn't figure out how to use the microphones. And that was the only way you were going to be heard. So rather than getting bothered by it, I sent an email the following day to the administration person on the SPC. And I was able to get a tour of the council chamber, and I was also shown how to use the microphones. And it sounds very simple, but it is, for me, it's that, I suppose, that nexus, I suppose, of finding how they can help you, but also having the courage to admit that you need the help and to ask for that help. So it's a two-way thing. So that's another thing that I've learned. And I suppose the other thing I have learned is, and I'm sure the other reps will associate with this in some ways, is that you have to keep pushing your agenda. I think you have to repeat yourself an awful lot of the time. So I've learned to be a little bit like a broken record when things come up in the SPC or in the linkage group. I'm the person that asks, you know, have people with disabilities or their respective organisations been informed? Have they been asked? Have they been consulted? And that was a learning for me as well, that it's not just enough to say something once. You need to say it many, many times to make it become a habit, or to make it be, you know, just that it actually becomes automatic within the linkage group or the SPC, that people might start remembering, oh, we need to consult with people with disabilities. We need to consult with their representative organisations. So that was also a big learning. And I suppose the final thing I learned is it can be frustrating. There's no two ways about it. It can be frustrating at times, because sometimes, you know, you might feel that your views aren't really being heard. But again, it comes back to, how do I react to that? Do I get annoyed over it, or do I perhaps approach the person on a one-to-one basis afterwards, or do I, you know, send a letter or an email? And they're all small learnings, but I think for me the biggest thing has been definitely learning for myself how to function within the PPN. And it's still, as I said, very much in its infancy, and I'm still learning as I go along.
Thank you so much, Maura. Incredible learnings, I think, that we can all identify with, and really some great points around how you can engage, I suppose, some of the barriers that are there in the first instance, and trying to challenge those, but then also looking at the frustrations that that you can face, and how you can turn those into tangible actions, or how you can use them to try and push forward even further. So thank you so much, Maura. That was really, really insightful. And Audrey, I might come to you with the same question, if that's okay, just around what you've learned from your experiences of being involved in the discussions where decisions are being made that affect so many different people. What has it been like having the seat at that table, I suppose, from your perspective?
As Maura said, it is a privilege, and it offered and has offered me a lot of insight, because not only am I representing, say, NCBI, yeah, there are agendas, but I, as I said to Liz recently, like, I have to focus on the kind of the greater agenda rather than my agenda. And what I mean by that is, okay, as a group of people with sight loss have specific, you know, requirements and needs, but we kind of share a lot, and there's a lot of overlap with other disability groups as well. And when the PPN meetings, for example, in the Dunleary Rathdown area, like, I get great, and I gain great insight from listening to what other people experience, kind of in their lived experience of people with disabilities. But equally, I find that being specific, for example, and kind of having kind of, usually before the meeting, I have points made out beforehand, and I would use kind of a braille kind of script that I would have, kind of, because very often, sometimes things get lost, so much going on at a meeting, and being blind, very often it's difficult to get the attention of the person, like the chair, when you can't make eye contact. But there are gentle ways of kind of interjecting and kind of asking and putting forward one's perspective, or asking a question. And it is a real education in terms of making people aware who may not know about sight loss, or the specific societal things that impact on those of us with sight loss. Being able to listen, and actively listen, is another skill and another kind of thing I've learned. And it comes in really, really easy, because very often, as I said, there's lots kind of discussion at the meetings, and it's kind of just drilling down and kind of getting the essence of what's been said and encapsulated, and trying to learn from others, and at the same time convey the specifics of, say, sight loss or blindness or whatever. So yeah, it's a huge learning curve, but it's great to be there, and it's good to be able to learn from other people, I think.
That's great, thank you. And I think that point about learning from each other is a really, really important one, because there's so much that we can learn from each other in everyday lives. And again, I think it comes back to similarly to what Maura was saying earlier around every day's been a school day in that sense as well. And there's always room to learn from each other. So thank you so much for that, Audrey. And David, the same question to you in terms of what have you learned from your involvement and engagement in these spaces so far, and what has your experience been of having that seat at the table?
Well, it's quite interesting because one of the reasons that people in 2014 by the government was institutions should be able to have representation from every background to be on the local government and the decision-making process, because this institution live within the council, and the members are there. They need to have a voice there, and NCBI has been very tremendous in this. So I really got in very lately because we tried as much as we can before COVID and halfway through COVID, but the response that were coming in was very low. But by June and July, I was able to being given the chance to sit down on one of the pillars, which is the social inclusion. And since then, we've not been able to have a meeting because there were many things going on. The first meeting that we, which was on the 4th of November, and that meeting was participants were updating about the activities, and I walked in and listened very attentively to understand what was going on. And I did realize that there are a lot of gaps there because most of the discussion that they had, I couldn't hear anything about disability. And interestingly, they have already proposed a project which was ongoing, and that has to do with voters campaign. It was a program they decided to launch in secondary schools to be able to bring youths on board, to be able to educate them to the leader that they want. And I think it didn't go on well. And I did say to them, well, there are a lot of problems out there, and if they were able to consider people that are disabled in schools and those that are blind, I think that was not done. So I decided to join that group, which of course, that will start effectively after next year. And I choose to volunteer to work with them. The reason is because, as my colleagues have just said, we have to speak. Every step of the way, it's our responsibility to be able to inject the awareness and to sensitize these people about disability and their involvement and participation in every affairs within decision making in the council, because it's really important. I think it's democratic, and I think it's the best practice for good governance. So that's how far we got when it comes to my joining with the social inclusion pillar. So it's going to be very difficult because of our experiences in terms of the challenges that we face as people in the community that are blind and visually impaired. So when you sit down on this table, your voice matters. And that's why I always say that I say my voice matters here, because when I'm speaking, I'm not only speaking on behalf of me, I'm speaking on behalf of the wider community. That is the blind and visually impaired persons that are in the council. Because as the first speaker said, our challenges and difficulties are the same. So when you are addressing these, you are cutting it across the entire population of people that are disabled in the community. Because if we can't speak, and when you speak, you're going to share light on an experience that none of the participants on the table have ever experienced. And you have to insist to tell them this is important, it is relevant, it has to be done the way it's supposed to be, because this has to be inclusive. We need to live in a society that is accessible, resourceful, that each and every one of us should forge ahead and have a saying in things and how we can able to make our needs necessary. You know, so that's my position, and that's always going to be my position. I know it's going to be tough, but as my colleagues have said, it needs patience, it needs consistency. Time and again, you have to reflect this. You have to tell them that's how it's going to be. So I'm looking forward to next year so that I can really involve into this and push this agenda forward.
That's brilliant, David. Thank you. And I might stick with you for our next question. And even just before I pose that question, I think it's really insightful to see such similar kind of views come forward from our panelists in terms of some of the experiences that they've had. And like you all mentioned in one way or another around the fact that you're representing more than yourself on those committees, and that it's so important to be able to do that. And David, again, you spoke about how there's new opportunities present themselves from being involved in these networks and being involved in these structures and committees, which is really fantastic. And I suppose looking at that and looking to the future, as you have said, what can be done, or how can representation of people with disabilities, be it sight loss or people who are blind or visually impaired or other disabilities, how can the representation of people with disabilities be in decision making be improved into the future? What can be, what if you had one thing, what would that thing be that could make it a more accessible system?
Lorna, there are two things here. The government is working hard to have reformed in the local communities and across the government system for the participation of disabled people in this decision-making process. But the legislation that is covering that, my position is, it has to be enforced. Meaning the government has to enforce this on all local institutions and public institutions to make sure that disabled people get involved consistently. That has to be enforced. That's one. Number two, in a budget and finance location, there should be a portion of money, a special budget set out for disabled institutions that are trained, capable enough to promote, encourage, and be able to serve this purpose. That is, they allow disabled people to get involved. They have to encourage them. They have to train them. For example, NCBI. NCBI is strategic in this position because they have the capacity, they have the resources to train, to mobilize people to get involved in advocacy. So the government had to put more money into this institution to create this awareness and to encourage people to join and to participate. I think those are the two areas that I think need to be addressed.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, David. And I suppose today's event, as we know, is supported by South Dublin County Council and trying to support wider engagement. So there are steps, but as you say, there's a long road ahead, and we need to get moving faster, much faster than we are currently. And Maura, I might pose the same question to yourself and then come back to you, Audrey, on that. So just around, how do you think that representation for people with disabilities in decision-making processes and in those kind of structures can be improved moving forward?
I think the two words that come to mind, and I suppose is looking at it from a very practical point of view, and the two things that come to mind for me are support and infrastructure. And by this I mean, okay, let's look at infrastructure first. So we can ask people with disabilities to join these committees. And I suppose over the last 18 months, it may have been a bit easier for some people because they were able to do it online. They did not have to leave their own homes. But unfortunately, I think there's a real rush to get back to in-person meetings, and don't get me wrong, because I think in-person meetings are so good, and they're a great way to build rapport with our fellow reps and our fellow councillors that we deal with. But I also think that people with disabilities might get lost in that if it all went back to in-person, that they may be excluded simply because the public transport may not be there to get them to the meetings. Then when they get to the meetings, it's more than just giving them that seat at the table, I think, or giving people that seat at the table. For me, it's more around how can we support people with disabilities to actually perform the roles that they need to perform during those meetings and in between those meetings on different subcommittees or having conversations with different people about different matters. So for me, even things like possibly a PA system whereby a person who is representing at a PPN or at any other representative situation, that a PA might be available to them. And it's not for the PA, obviously, to do their work, but to assist them. So again, to go back to that incident earlier with the microphone, perhaps if I'd had a PA with me that day, I may have been able to engage with that meeting more because the PA could have shown me how to use the microphone. It sounds very simple, but I think it is a key part in how we get people to the table. And I think beyond that then is kind of encouraging people to take part, encouraging people to actively participate in politics. I don't mean politics as in party politics, but politics as in having their say in decisions that impact on their lives. And I think this is where things like the UNCRPD come into play. That we need the support, the infrastructure, the encouragement for that to happen. And I think that until that does happen and that it's automatically a right that people, if they get that seat at the table, that they have this automatic right to find a way to get to the meeting, to be supported while they're at the meeting. And I think until those two things happen, people with disabilities are going to be, unfortunately, I suppose, left a little bit behind in terms of representing themselves in policy decision making.
That was really insightful, Maura. Thank you so much. And I think you summed it up so well there. And it's about meaningful engagement in decision making. And so it's to ensure that it's not tokenistic, that it's not just about having that seat. It's about more than that. It's about being able to engage, and that requires additional supports within the system. And I think you highlighted that so well. And I think you're right that the word politics can sometimes be a word that people very much shy away from, and totally understandably why. But it is about trying to move away from, or move towards, that rights-based system, as you say, that it's a right that you have a seat at that table, and it's a right that you have the support that you need to be able to engage in a meaningful way. So thank you so much. And Audrey, this is probably a tough one now after following up after all of that fantastic those contributions, but just to get your view and your thoughts on this in terms of how the system can be improved moving forward to ensure that there can be that meaningful representation with people in those decision-making structures.
Yeah, it's a very profound question, and it's one I think about a lot, Lorna. I think progress and change often can be slow, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because there's no point, I often think, rushing into kind of rash decisions and then having to overturn those decisions and start again. Okay, we're all on a learning curve. I don't expect when I meet somebody who can see to know how to, for example, cater for the needs of me as somebody blind, but I do I do look for a willingness and an openness in mindset. So that's a attitudinal stereotypes or perceptions that are not kind of realistic kind of can be dismantled. So I think openness in mindset definitely evolves change and can bring about change, and a seat at the table for everyone regardless of background and life experience. I think to walk in somebody else's shoes, I've learned as well, has really been useful. And what I mean by that is just to see life from somebody else's vantage point. And I'd say I'm speaking on behalf of my own life experience as well, kind of how I see and how I've learned from other people who also have a seat at the table. So that is really useful as well. I think politics is a good word, and it's not a word I'd be kind of worried about, because I think there's politics in everyday life, and the politics of disability is so important as well, and can be used really to educate and to make everybody aware, regardless of whether or not somebody has a disability. So yeah, I think they would be the kind of the key, factors and learning pillars that I would have kind of found really useful.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Audrey. And I think you're right in terms of a mindset, and willingness is really really important. It's a really important first step for anybody to be able to engage in any of these discussions. And I agree with you on the politics piece, might I add, but I know many others may wish to pull back. But just to say a massive thank you to Audrey and to David and to Maura. And I know David was having some internet connection issues, so he's joined in with us on phone. So we're delighted to have the use of such technology to ensure that we can have all of our fantastic panelists here with us today. Liz, I might ask, have we had any questions come through that we can pose to the panelists before we close off today?
No, we haven't, because I think everyone has answered the questions so thoroughly and so beautifully.
They have. I can 100% agree with that. I think everybody joining us on the call can agree to that. So what I might just do is to thank our panelists for joining us today, and to thank everybody who's called in and who's watching on. But I think a particular word of thanks must go to Maura and to Audrey and to David for joining us and speaking so honestly, eloquently about their experiences. And it shows us that while there have been improvements and while things have improved over the past number of months and years, particularly with the UNCRPD and so on, that there is a long road ahead of us, and it's really important that we all work together to improve the situation moving forward, to ensure that whenever there is a seat available, whenever there's a table, that the seat is not only provided as a right, but also those supports to ensure that there can be meaningful engagement in all of those discussions, and that's so important. But I think it's very clear that we have such fantastic representatives across our staff and advocate networks out on different committees representing NCBI and themselves and the views of other people who are living with sight loss in Ireland. Just to let everybody know that we do have previous advocacy talks that are available on our YouTube channel, and you can access those through the website on www.ncbi.ie. But also, if anybody has been listening today and really wants to get involved themselves in representation or in any of our advocacy work, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're more than happy to engage and have conversations about the different opportunities that are there, to talk about the different training opportunities that David had referenced earlier, and to make sure that you feel confident and comfortable in being able to have that seat at that table and be that representative for yourself and for others. So don't ever hesitate to reach out to us. We're always more than happy to have those conversations. So without further ado, I might close us off for today and say Gur Mila Magat, and thank you very much to everybody for attending.